Hello there and welcome to Bobeats. Today we are going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a look at my track Retribution and kind of take you through the process of how I made it. And I'm going to show you all the steps from Digitakt Jam to mixing to releasing it on Spotify and iTunes. And therefore I have DistroKid on as a sponsor for today's video because that's the service that I use to get my tracks published on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Music and the like. And if you want to sign up with DistroKid, you can use my link in the description for 7% off. First, let's compare what the track sounds like straight out of the Digitakt compared to the finished version. What I aimed for in the mixing process was added clarity and a wider stereo field, but we'll get to that later. First, let's take a look at some tips on how to make a full song on the Digitakt. Now, when you set out to create a full song on a Digitakt, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first thing I always do is try and have some kind of logical layout for the patterns. So here you can see the entire track. So it's basically 8 main patterns and a variation. So I always put the variation beneath the pattern that I'm actually copying and creating a variation of. So for example, this pattern here. Pattern 14 and 6 are basically the same, with the difference that I've cut some of the high frequencies on the synth sound and I've added this vocal chop to pattern 14. Now what I have here is simply a progression. So we have intro. On pattern 2 and 3 we have 2 different variations of the verse. So I'm just connecting them together so you can see how they interconnect. And then we have a couple of different chorus type patterns. So you can basically call them like different themes. So here's one. Here's another one. Now, when I recorded the full song, I actually did it manually, so I didn't chain anything because one limitation to making a full song on the Digitakt is, of course, that there's no real song mode. You can chain patterns together, creating, a longer chain like this, but it's hard to create something more complex like a song where you jump between different sections or different banks, for example. This is something where the more expensive Electron boxes shine because they do have this song mode. Now, another thing to consider, it's sort of a limitation, but there's workarounds, it's the voices. So you have 8 sample channels, but you can of course extend them using sample locks. So sample lock, if we go to a separate track here, is simply that when you have, say, a kick drum like this, you can basically sample lock. So you hold down a trig and you go to source and you select something else. Suddenly you're playing 2 samples from the one track. So this can of course be used to extend the 8 voices and have even more possibilities to create complex loops. Now, to not get carried away with the voices, I usually use 4 tracks for drums and 4 tracks for the melodic stuff. So here we have, for example, a piano. The bass. Hi-hat. Synth sound. A little clap, the kick, and I'm sorry S from Electron, this is the default kick. I know, this is quite an old beat actually, where I use the default kit. We have some effects. And as you heard, I also have this flute. And speaking about the sounds, the samples I'm using here, I want to show you a couple of different things here about it. So here, for example, I have this flute. And it's actually played backwards. So if I change it to normal again. And if we change the length. This is what it sounds like. So basically, I've just made a little short snippet of it. I'm playing it backwards. I'm using a filter envelope. And I also added some attack, delay, and reverb to it. And of course, some bit reduction to it as well. This sample isn't really tuned that much. This actually fit pretty nicely. So sometimes I just go through the samples and I see what fits. And sometimes you really have to tune it. That's an important part. You know, even if you can't play it chromatically, depending on the root note, I suppose, like the basic tuning of the sample, you might have to go in and tune it. What I really enjoy using something like a flute sample is that you get this sort of organic aspect to it. You get some of that human articulation, and then you can use it creating your own melodies, which is, I think, is very cool. Another sound we're talking about is this one. This is a synth sound that I created on the Digitakt. This is actually quite funny for you who have been following the channel for a while. I'm using the standard bass drum, so it's a kick. I'm using the basic kick drum, and I've turned it into this loop. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using a very, if you look here, start and length are very short. So if I increase it, we have something closer to the original kick drum. And if I shorten it, now for the drums, there's nothing really super exciting going on in terms of sound design, but I am doing something worth mentioning. Did you catch it? Well, I'm using retrigs here on the hi-hat. So over here on page 2, I have one retrig set up. And if we go to the 4th page, I have the more interesting one. So this is 1 in 12, which gives it this, I'm not sure what it's called in rhythmic terms, but you can hear it sort of slows down the beat. I think it's called a triplet, but please don't quote me on that. I'm not a rhythm wizard. On the hi-hats, I'm also doing panning. So I've set the LFO to amp pan, and I have a bit of depth. I'm using a square wave here, but you can do it in different ways, and it just gives the sound a little bit more of a stereo space. Now, of course, you can do this if you multi-track into a computer. You could sort this out later as well, but this is something I often do, just using LFO to pan. Another thing worth mentioning is that I'm not using the master compressor. There's one reason. I don't want to affect the dynamics too much. I want to save that for the mixing stage. And lastly, before we move on, here's a little tip. If you actually do mixing inside of the Digitakt and you don't want to multi-track record, remember that you can switch the filter from low pass to high pass. So high pass is really good for mixing because a lot of sounds have a lot of low end or bass that you don't need. So you can just switch it to the high pass and cut the lows. This will give the mix a much cleaner sound because it easily gets muddied if you want to do all the mixing inside of this unit. Next up, let's talk a little bit about what I did when the song was finished, and I wanted to get it inside of my computer for mixing. You can record your Digitakt into your computer in different ways. You can go stereo outputs into your audio interface or recorder, and you can also do multi-tracking via overbridge. So you can either do overbridge inside of a DAW, or you can do like I do and use the standalone recorder. So here you can see that I'm recording the 8 individual tracks, as well as the stereo outputs. Now the stereo outputs are dedicated in this setup for the effects, and this is a setup that you do on the Digitakt itself. You basically set it so that only the effects are sending to the main outputs, and the individual 8 tracks are sending to the individual 8 track outputs. Next up, let's take a look at my mixing process. So the sound you're hearing now is of course pre-mastered, but it's running through the analog heat as well. So I actually have, if we take a look here on the master track here, we have the analog heat. And just to give you kind of an A/B listen here, it basically just saturates the sound. I think it brings out some finer details, which is kind of cool. So here's without analog heat on it. Let's add it. So what else do we have going on here? Well, one of the main sound is a piano sound. And what I've done here with the piano was, you can see I boosted the highs a lot. I removed a lot of the lows. We didn't need those because it's kind of a lo-fi piano. There wasn't really much lows going on to begin with. And then we have a reverb. So let's take a look at, we have one effects track here. Basically have the reverence reverb, like a big reverb, and a stereo delay. We have a synth sound here as well, the synth ARP. And it's really dry and kind of boring, but I thought that it actually fit pretty well. Because there is a lot of reverb to the piano and stuff. So yeah, the synth ARP is like super dry, but then when we go move into a different part here in the song, I actually made this second duplicate, and I added the choral and a transient master, and I tweaked the EQ a bit on the synth sound because I wanted it to stand out more in this part. So you can hear kind of the difference if you listen to the synth sound. For the drums, I did a bit of EQing, just a smidge, removed some of the lows on the kick here. And yeah, for the hi-hat, did a little bit of EQing as well. Clap, I don't know, did I? Yeah, I just cut the lows, sent it to the reverb as well. And then I just fed everything into a drum bus and I slapped the neutron on top of it. The drum preset really beats up the sound here without. For the bass, I removed a bit of the lows because I wanted kind of the kick to be more prominent in the mix and not clash too much with the bass. And then I just added a bit of, yeah, over here on 200 Hertz and 1000 Hertz, just kind of make it pop a little bit more in the mix. I don't know how much of a difference it makes. As you know, all the small things kind of add up. So yeah, I think that was pretty much what I did with it. Now, next up in the process, what I did was I did a real-time render or real-time mix down, because I have the analog heat slapped on top of it, so you can't just bounce it, you have to do a real-time export. After the real-time render, what I do is I put my WAV file inside of Ozone 8, and I use the mastering assistant that listens to your track and sets up a preset for you that suits the track. Now, people have various opinions on this. I think it works nicely, but I am not a mastering engineer. Of course, having a professional to do it would be a lot better, and I also think you can do something similar with the plugins in your DAW. Cubase, for example, comes with a lot of great mastering tools as well. However, I think this is mostly just to do the final touch-up on the tracks. You can see I did a bit of EQ, some dynamic EQ, and a maximizer. And that was pretty much it. I toyed around with, for example, the vintage tape, which can add a lot of interesting character, but since I already had the analog heat on it, it didn't really fit. So I kept my mastering process simple, and the idea was just to make it sound a little bit better. And just to compare, let's listen to the raw Digitakt, the mixed version, and the mastered version. Then I go to DistroKid, which is today's sponsor. It's one of many services that lets you upload music to Spotify, iTunes, Apple Music, and other stores. You go here, you click upload. Now, some of the settings here might vary depending on what subscription you actually use. They have a bunch of different options. We'll take a look at that as well. You can go and upload to different types of stores. You can choose number of songs. If it's been previously released, add artist band name, and a bunch of other settings. So for example, if I were to do this, I would just scroll down here. I would pick my file. The name of the file doesn't matter. You basically name it over here. So I'll name it Retribution. And then we select a genre, secondary genre, and we add some art. We can also pay for extras, and this is free with my subscription, Instagram and Facebook. I always do this as well, so I can use my music in my Instagram stories, for example. But the other ones I really don't care about. Then you click the boxes, press done, it uploads, and it does take between a couple of days and 1-2 weeks to get onto all the stores. This, of course, depends a little bit depending on the store. Usually Spotify is a couple of days, it's pretty quick. Spotify is among the quickest. Takes a little bit longer for iTunes and Apple Music, for example. Now, one feature that DistroKid wanted me to talk about is the Themes feature. It's actually quite clever, and this is a feature that a friend of mine used for a collaboration we did. So let me just show you here. If we take the track Retribution, click next, what we can do here is we can add new team members using their email addresses, and we can do a revenue share. So if you do, say, a collab album with multiple producers or multiple songwriters, this is a great way to share the revenue across a large team, and it actually works very smoothly. DistroKid, of course, offers different subscription services. Basically, you can upload unlimited amount of tracks using any of them, but you do get different types of perks depending on the level. Now, I would actually say that Musician Plus is probably the sweet spot because you do get Spotify verified checkmark, you can upload unlimited lyrics, you get daily sales stats, customizable label name, customizable release dates, and all the stuff that you really do want. So I think comparing the $20 a year to the $35 or $36 a year, I think the Musician Plus is a lot better. Also, you can have 2 artists or band names. You can actually upload 2 different projects, which is kind of cool. If you're with me this far, thank you so much for watching my little walkthrough of how I turned my Digitakt jam into a finished song. I hope you got something out of it. Please, if there's stuff you want to know, leave comments down below. I try and answer as much as possible. And if you want to, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video. So thank you so much. Have a great day.